The November morning arrived cold and sharp in downtown Portland, Maine. A bitter wind swept through Congress Street, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant promise of snow. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the red brick buildings that lined the parade route like silent witnesses to history. American flags snapped violently in the gusts, their stars and stripes blurring into waves of patriotic fervor as thousands gathered along the sidewalks. It was Veterans Day, and the annual parade had drawn crowds from across Cumberland County. Families bundled in thick coats stood 3 and 4 deep along the barriers. Children perched on parents' shoulders, veterans wearing caps emblazoned with war insignias standing at attention. The air buzzed with anticipation, punctuated by the distant rumble of drums and the metallic clink of military equipment being ready just blocks away. Marcus Riley stood in formation with his Cub Scout troop near the staging area behind Portland City Hall. At 9 years old, he was small for his age, with unruly brown hair that refused to stay flat under his blue scout cap and serious hazel eyes that seemed to carry thoughts too heavy for a child. His uniform was pressed crisp by his grandmother that morning, every badge perfectly aligned, though his neckerchief had already gone slightly crooked in the wind. "Remember, boys," Mr. Peterson, their troop leader, called out over the noise, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "We walk in straight lines. We stay together. We represent something bigger than ourselves today. These veterans sacrificed everything so we could stand here free. The least we can do is show them proper respect." The other scouts nodded eagerly, some practicing their salutes, others joking nervously to burn off the cold and excitement. But Marcus remained still, his gloved hands clenched at his sides, his gaze distant and unfocused. He wasn't thinking about the parade, or the formation, or staying in line. His mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had consumed his thoughts for weeks now, ever since his grandmother had sat him down at the kitchen table and told him the truth. "Marcus, you listening?" Tommy Chun, his best friend, nudged him with an elbow. "You okay? You look like you're going to be sick." Marcus blinked, pulling himself back to the present moment. "I'm fine," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. His stomach did feel strange, twisted with something between anxiety and determination, like standing at the edge of a high dive, knowing you had to jump. The parade marshal's whistle pierced the morning air. 3 sharp blasts. The signal to begin. The marching band struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever, and the parade lurched into motion like some great mechanical beast coming to life. First came the color guard, their movements precise and synchronized, followed by a convoy of vintage military vehicles carrying elderly veterans who waved the crowds with weathered hands. Then came active duty service members in dress uniforms, their boots striking the pavement in perfect rhythm, creating a sound like distant thunder. The Cub Scout troop was positioned in the middle section, behind a group of VFW members and ahead of the high school ROTC unit. As they rounded the corner onto Congress Street proper, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. People waved small flags, held up homemade signs thanking veterans, and raised smartphones to capture the moment. Marcus walked mechanically, his legs moving but his attention scanning the crowd. He was looking for someone specific. His grandmother had described her location, near the intersection of Congress and High Street, standing away from the main crowds, probably toward the back where fewer people gathered. She wouldn't be waving or cheering. She would be still, almost invisible. The cold bit at Marcus's exposed cheeks and ears, but he barely noticed. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force, he wondered if Tommy could hear it. The street seemed to stretch on forever, each building facade blurring into the next as he searched face after face in the crowd. "Eyes forward, Marcus," Mr. Peterson called from the side of the formation, walking alongside them. "Stay with the group." But Marcus couldn't stop looking, wouldn't stop looking. This was too important. They passed the Monument Square, where a cluster of older veterans saluted as the scouts went by. They passed the Art Museum with its distinctive brick architecture. They passed storefront after storefront, the crowd noise rising and falling like ocean waves. And then he saw her. She stood alone near a lamppost at the edge of the gathering, set back from the barrier where most spectators pressed forward. She wore a long, dark coat, her graying blonde hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful once, but now seemed carved from something harder than flesh. She wasn't waving. She wasn't smiling. She simply stood there, hands buried in her coat pockets, watching the parade with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read from this distance but recognized nonetheless. It was the same expression his grandmother sometimes wore late at night, when she thought no one was looking, sitting alone in the living room with a photograph clutched in her hands. It was the expression of someone haunted by absence. Marcus's feet slowed, without conscious thought. The scouts around him continued marching, the formation beginning to bend around his sudden stillness, like water flowing past a stone. "Marcus," Tommy hissed. "What are you doing? Keep moving." But Marcus had already made his decision. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. She needs to know someone remembers. She needs to know she's not forgotten, that he's not forgotten. Without another moment's hesitation, Marcus stepped completely out of formation. The movement rippled through the crowd immediately. Heads turned. Parents pointed. Other scouts stumbled slightly as their formation broke. Mr. Peterson's face went red with alarm and embarrassment. "Marcus Riley, get back in line," he shouted, his voice sharp with panic. But Marcus didn't stop. He walked with steady, deliberate steps toward the woman by the lamppost, his small figure cutting across the parade route perpendicular to the flow of marchers. The ROTC unit behind them had to pause their advance, causing a brief accordion effect in the parade formation. The crowd murmured with confusion and curiosity. Was the boy lost? Was he running to a parent? Was something wrong? Marcus reached the barrier that separated spectators from the parade route. A police officer moved to intercept him. But something in the boy's expression, something in the focused intensity of his purpose, made the officer pause just long enough for Marcus to slip past. The woman hadn't noticed him yet. Her gaze remained fixed on the parade itself, or perhaps on something beyond it that only she could see, somewhere in the distance where memory and reality blurred together. Marcus approached her slowly, respectfully. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped and stood at attention, his back straight in the way his grandfather had taught him years ago when he was still alive and demonstrating his Marine Corps posture in their backyard. Then, with his right hand trembling slightly from cold and emotion, Marcus raised his hand to his forehead in the crispest, most perfect salute a 9-year-old boy could manage. The woman's eyes finally focused on him. For a moment, she simply stared, confusion crossing her weathered features. The parade continued behind them, but in this small pocket of space, time seemed to suspend itself. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his young voice somehow cutting through the noise and reaching her with perfect clarity. "I'm saluting you for Captain Daniel Reeves. He was a hero, and so are you." The name struck her like a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid, her eyes widening with shock that quickly transformed into something more complex, something that combined pain and recognition and a desperate, hungry need to understand what was happening. Her hand rose to her mouth, fingers splayed across her lips as if holding back a sound too raw to release. Her eyes, gray-blue and suddenly brimming with tears she'd probably held back for years, locked onto the small boy before her. "How do you—" she started, her voice breaking on the words. "How do you know that name?" The world seemed to collapse into a narrow tunnel containing only Marcus Riley and the woman whose name he'd learned just weeks ago, Elizabeth Reeves. Behind them, the parade had slowed to a confused crawl, spectators craning their necks to see what was unfolding, but Marcus remained focused entirely on the woman before him. His salute still held firm despite his small arm beginning to shake with the effort. Elizabeth Reeves stared at the boy as if he were a ghost, or perhaps as if she were the ghost, and he was the first living person to acknowledge her existence in years. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, cutting tracks to what Marcus realized was carefully applied makeup meant to hide darker shadows beneath, evidence of countless sleepless nights. "My grandmother," Marcus said, finally lowering his salute but maintaining his straight posture. "My grandmother is Catherine Riley. She said you used to be friends. Before everything happened." The name Catherine Riley seemed to unlock something in Elizabeth. Her knees buckled slightly, and she reached out to the lamppost for support, her knuckles going white as she gripped the cold metal. Marcus instinctively stepped forward, concerned, his hand reaching out in that automatic way children have when they see someone in distress. "Kathy," Elizabeth whispered, the name escaping her lips like a prayer or a curse. Something sacred she'd forbidden herself from speaking aloud for too long. "Oh, God, Kathy sent you." The police officer who'd hesitated earlier now approached more deliberately, his expression a mixture of concern and uncertainty. "Ma'am, is everything all right here? Son, you need to—" "It's okay," Elizabeth said quickly, finding her voice despite its trembling quality. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing mascara that left dark crescents under her eyes. "It's okay. This is okay." Mr. Peterson had abandoned the scout troop to another parent volunteer and now pushed the crowd toward them, his face still flushed with embarrassment and confusion. "Marcus, what on earth do you think you're doing? You disrupted the entire—" "Mr. Peterson," Marcus said, turning to face his troop leader with that same serious expression, that weight in his young eyes that made adults uncomfortable because children weren't supposed to carry such things. "I had to salute her. My grandmother asked me to. She's Captain Reeves's widow." The name didn't mean anything to Mr. Peterson, but it meant everything to several veterans in the nearby crowd. One older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap straightened suddenly, his eyes going wide. Another whispered something to a companion, and the whisper spread like wind through dry grass, rustling from person to person. Reeves. Captain Daniel Reeves. That widow, the one who disappeared. Elizabeth heard the whispers and flinched as if each one were a physical touch, an invasion of the privacy she constructed so carefully around her grief. She looked at Marcus again, the small boy who'd somehow found her in a crowd of thousands, who'd broken every rule to offer a gesture no one else had thought to give. "Why?" she asked him, her voice barely audible over the parade noise. "Why would Catherine send you? After all these years, why now?" Marcus took a deep breath, the way his grandmother had taught him when he needed to say something difficult. "Because she says you've been alone too long. She says you stopped coming to the veterans' events. You stopped answering the phone. She says everyone forgot about the families left behind, but she didn't forget, and she didn't want you to think we all forgot about Captain Reeves either." The words landed with devastating precision. Elizabeth's face crumpled, and for a moment Marcus thought she might collapse entirely. But instead, she did something he didn't expect. She knelt down on a cold concrete sidewalk, right there in front of everyone, bringing herself to his eye level, her expensive coat scraped against the rough ground, but she didn't seem to notice or care. "Your grandmother," she said, reaching out to gently touch Marcus's shoulder with a trembling hand, "is the kindest person I ever met. And what you just did—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Fresh tears came, these ones seeming to carry years of accumulated sorrow, as if the boy's simple gesture had breached a dam she'd spent a decade building brick by careful brick. The crowd around them had shifted. The parade continued in the background, but a significant portion of nearby spectators now watched this intimate scene unfolding at the street's edge. Some raised their phones to record, but others, sensing something sacred in the moment, lowered their cameras and simply bore witness. Mr. Peterson seemed torn between his duty to maintain order and his growing realization that he was witnessing something more important than a parade formation. "We need to. The troop is waiting," he said weakly, but his protest lacked conviction. "Let him stay a moment," the police officer said quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood more than he was saying, perhaps had his own history with loss and recognition. "The parade can wait." Elizabeth reached into her coat pocket with shaking hands and pulled out what Marcus immediately recognized as a military challenge coin. It was worn smooth in places from being handled, turned over and over in restless fingers, a talisman carried everywhere like a piece of her heart made tangible. "This was Danny's," she said, holding it up so Marcus could see the Army insignia embossed on one side and what looked like a unit patch on the other. "His commander gave it to me at the funeral. It was in his pocket when it happened. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, a roadside bomb." Marcus nodded solemnly. His grandmother had told him the basics, prepared him for this conversation. Captain Daniel Reeves had been killed 7 years ago while leading a convoy through hostile territory. He'd been 32 years old. He'd died instantly which everyone assured Elizabeth was a mercy, though she'd never found much mercy in it. He carried it for luck, Elizabeth continued, her thumb tracing the worn edges. He always said as long as he had this, he'd come home, but he didn't come home, did he? So I carried it instead. Every day, everywhere, thinking maybe if I carried it long enough, I could somehow bring him back, or... She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Or something. I don't even know anymore. The wind picked up, colder now, promising the snow that had been threatening all morning. Someone in the crowd began clapping slowly, and others joined until a wave of applause spread through this section of spectators. They didn't fully understand what they were witnessing, but they recognized respect when they saw it, recognized love and loss, and the courage it took to stand in public with your grief exposed. Elizabeth looked up at the sound, startled, as if she'd forgotten there were other people in the world. Her face flushed with embarrassment and something else, something that might have been the first spark of warmth Marcus had seen in her expression. "I don't come to these things anymore," she said, turning her attention back to Marcus. "Not for years. It hurt too much. Watching everyone celebrate their living veterans while mine was in the ground. Watching families together while I was alone. Hearing, 'Thank you for your sacrifice,' like your sacrifice was some abstract concept instead of the person you love more than your own heartbeat. But you came today," Marcus observed. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I came today because it's the 7th anniversary. November 11th. 7 years since the knock on the door. 7 years since 2 officers stood on my porch and said words that turned my entire life into before and after. I thought, I don't know what I thought. That maybe if I came and stood here and watched, I could feel close to him again, or prove I hadn't forgotten, or punish myself for still being alive when he isn't." She shook her head. "None of it makes sense." "It makes sense to my grandmother," Marcus said. "She says grief doesn't have to make sense to anyone but the person feeling it." Elizabeth's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Your grandmother is a wise woman. We used to be so close, Kathy and I. Before Danny died, we have coffee every week. We'd talk for hours. She was there at the funeral. She tried to help after, but I couldn't. I couldn't let anyone in. I couldn't function. I quit my job. I stopped answering calls. I moved to a different apartment because the old one had too many memories. I just disappeared. And eventually, people stopped trying to reach me. I thought I wanted that. I thought isolation was the same thing as protection." A veteran in the crowd, the older man with the Vietnam cap who'd recognized Captain Reeves's name, stepped forward carefully. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with emotion and cigarettes and decades of carrying his own memories. "I served with your husband's unit, in a different rotation. Different time, but same soil. I want you to know he was respected. What he did, leading from the front, protecting his soldiers, that kind of leadership saves lives. My grandson is alive today because officers like your husband trained the men who trained him." Elizabeth stood slowly, Marcus rising with her. She faced the veteran with an expression of such naked gratitude and pain that several people in the crowd looked away, unable to bear the intimacy of it. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you for telling me that." Another voice called from the crowd. "My daughter served under Captain Reeves. She's alive because of his decision-making." And then another, "He was my platoon leader's mentor." The testimonials came like offerings laid in an invisible altar, each voice adding another piece to the mosaic of Daniel Reeves's legacy. Marcus watched Elizabeth's face transform as she listened, watched years of isolation begin to crack like ice under spring sun. She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone. The community of people who knew what her husband had meant, who carried pieces of his impact in their own stories, had always been there. She'd just been too buried in grief to see them. The parade had officially stopped now, not just slowed but come to a complete halt. The marshal was speaking urgently into a radio. Try to understand why the flow had been disrupted, but the veterans in the immediate area were already explaining, their voices carrying authority that overrode official protocols. This was more important than schedules or formations. This was what the parade was supposed to be about, remembering, honoring, connecting the living to those who'd served and sacrificed. Elizabeth Reeves stood surrounded by an impromptu gathering of strangers who somehow weren't strangers at all, each one connected to her dead husband through service, through shared spaces in the vast geography of military life, through the invisible threads that bound the military community together across time and distance. Marcus remained close to her, his small presence a grounding force. His hand now held gently in hers, as if she needed the physical connection to believe this was really happening. Catherine Riley, Marcus's grandmother, had been watching from further down the street, where she positioned herself deliberately, wanting to give her grandson space to do what he'd volunteered to do, but needing to be close enough to intervene if necessary. Now she pushed through the crowd with the determined efficiency of a woman who'd raised 3 children and buried a husband, her silver hair bright under the gray sky, her lined face set with purposeful emotion. "Lizzie," she called out, using the nickname only she had been permitted to use. "Lizzie, oh my dear girl." Elizabeth's head snapped up at the sound of that voice, that name no one had called her in 7 years. "Kathy." Her voice broke completely. "Kathy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm sorry I didn't." But Catherine was already there, pulling Elizabeth into a fierce embrace that seemed to compress all 7 years of separation into a single moment of reconnection. The 2 women clung to each other while the parade waited, and the crowd watched, and Marcus stood witness to the power of friendship that survived even the deepest grief. "You have nothing to apologize for," Catherine whispered fiercely, loudly enough that Marcus and several others could hear. "Nothing. You survived the unsurvivable. You're still here. That's enough. That's more than enough." When they finally separated, both women were crying freely, their tears mixing with the cold wind that whipped down Congress Street. Catherine turned to her grandson with pride radiating from every line of her face. "You did good, Marcus. You did so good." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd been nervous for weeks after his grandmother had told him Elizabeth's story, after she'd explained what she wanted him to do and why it mattered. He'd practiced a salute in the mirror dozens of times, worried he'd get it wrong, worried he'd make things worse somehow. But standing here now, seeing Elizabeth's face, seeing the community gathering around her like a living memorial to Captain Reeves, he understood why his grandmother had called this important. Mr. Peterson approached more carefully now, his earlier frustration transformed into something resembling awe. "Mrs. Riley," he said respectfully, "I apologize for my reaction earlier. I didn't understand what was happening." Catherine waved him off with the gracious authority of someone who dealt with plenty of well-meaning but confused officials in her time. "You were doing your job, keeping the boys in line. But sometimes the right thing means breaking the formation." She squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "My husband, Marcus's grandfather, was a Marine. He taught Marcus that salute. He also taught him that honor means recognizing those who served and those who sacrificed, not just the service members themselves, but their families, the ones left behind to carry the weight of absence." One of the veterans in the crowd, a woman wearing an Air Force jacket, spoke up. "Ma'am, with your permission, we'd like to do something." She gestured to the dozen or so veterans who'd gathered nearby. "If you'll allow it, we'd like to salute Captain Reeves. Here, now, a proper recognition." Elizabeth looked stunned. You don't have to." "We know we don't have to," the woman said gently. "We want to. He was our brother in arms. You're our sister. Let us do this." Elizabeth couldn't speak. She simply nodded, her hand pressed against her mouth again, tears flowing freely. The veterans formed up with practiced efficiency, creating a line despite their varying ages, branches, and levels of mobility. Some stood ramrod straight despite visible age and injury. Others leaned on canes but held their salutes firm. They faced Elizabeth Reeves, and as one, they raised their hands in salute. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the parade bands in the distance seemed to quiet, though perhaps that was just the way sound works when something sacred occurs, when the world itself seems to hold its breath. Marcus, standing beside Elizabeth, raised his hand once again in salute, his small figure dwarfed by the adult veterans surrounding him, but no less important, no less meaningful. Catherine Riley stood with her hand over her heart, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "For Captain Daniel Reeves," the Air Force veteran called out, her voice carrying clear and strong. who led with courage and died with honor, and for his widow, Elizabeth Reeves, who carries on with grace. We salute you both." The salute held for a long moment, and in that moment, something profound occurred. Elizabeth Reeves, who'd spent 7 years disappearing into grief, who convinced herself that her loss was invisible and her pain was hers alone to bear, suddenly saw herself reflected in the eyes of this impromptu honor guard. She saw that she mattered, that Daniel's sacrifice mattered not in some abstract patriotic sense, but in the concrete reality of lives touched, soldiers trained, decisions made that rippled forward through time. When the veterans finally lowered their salutes, Elizabeth found her voice. "Thank you," she said, and then louder, "Thank you. Daniel would be—" She couldn't finish, overwhelmed by emotion, but she didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. The parade marshal, having been informed of the situation, made a decision that would later be praised by some and questioned by others, but was ultimately the right one. He called for an official moment of silence. His voice came through the loudspeakers positioned along the parade route. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause our parade for a moment of silence to honor Captain Daniel Reeves, United States Army, killed in action 7 years ago today in Afghanistan, and to honor his widow, Elizabeth Reeves, and all the families who carry the weight of sacrifice every single day. Please join us in this moment of remembrance." The entire parade route fell silent. Thousands of people standing in the November cold stopped their conversations, lowered their phones, removed their hats. The wind continued to blow. Flags continued to snap in the breeze, but human sound ceased completely. In that silence, Elizabeth closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel what she'd been avoiding for so long. Not just the pain of Daniel's absence, but the love that had surrounded that absence all along, waiting for her to be ready to see it. Marcus watched her face change in that silence, watched something that had been clenched tight inside her begin to loosen and release. His grandmother had been right. Sometimes people needed to be reminded they weren't alone. Sometimes they needed someone to break the formation, to step out of line, to offer the gesture no one else thought to give. When the moment of silence ended and the parade marshal gave the signal to resume, the crowd erupted in applause that rolled down Congress Street like thunder. But Elizabeth barely heard it. She was kneeling again, this time pulling Marcus into a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered into his ear, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for remembering him. Thank you for being brave enough to walk over here. My grandpa always said the brave thing and the scared thing are sometimes the same thing," Marcus replied, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "You just have to do it even when you're scared." Elizabeth laughed through her tears, a real laugh, perhaps her first genuine one in years. "Your grandpa was a smart man." "He was," Marcus agreed. "Grandma says I'm like him. Stubborn and loyal. Those are good things to be," Elizabeth said, releasing him but keeping her hands on his shoulders, looking directly into his serious young eyes. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Catherine joined them, putting her arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. "Come on, Lizzie. Let's get out of this cold. Let's go somewhere warm and have coffee like we used to. We have 7 years of catching up to do, and I'm not letting you disappear again." Elizabeth looked at her old friend, then at Marcus, then at the crowd of veterans and strangers who'd witnessed this moment and made it sacred through their attention and respect. She felt something shift inside her, something fundamental. The weight was still there. Grief that profound doesn't simply vanish, but it no longer felt like something she had to carry alone in the dark. "Okay," she said simply. "Okay, let's go have coffee." The coffee shop Catherine Riley chose was a small local place called the Blue Spoon, tucked into a side street just off the parade route. It was a kind of establishment that felt like stepping into someone's comfortable living room, with mismatched furniture, local art on exposed brick walls, and the rich aroma of fresh roasted beans filling the warm air. The floors were original hardwood, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the windows were fogged slightly from the temperature difference between the cold November air outside and the cozy warmth within. A chalkboard menu hung behind the counter, listing drinks with creative names and seasonal specials written in elaborate script. By the time they arrived, the parade had resumed its normal course, but word of what happened had already spread through social media and text messages. creating ripples that would extend far beyond this single November morning. Elizabeth, Catherine, and Marcus claimed a corner table near a window that looked out onto a quiet street, where the parade noise was distant and muffled. The table was small and round, its surface scarred with the gentle marks of years of use, and surrounded by 3 mismatched chairs, one wooden, one upholstered in faded burgundy, and one metal with a cushion that had seen better days. Marcus ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, his eyes lighting up when the barista, a young woman with kind eyes and colorful tattoos covering her arms, promised to make it extra special. The 2 women ordered coffee, Catherine insisting on paying despite Elizabeth's weak protests, adding 2 oversized blueberry muffins to the order because, as she put, emotional moments require carbohydrates. As they settled in, peeling off coats and scarves and draping them over the backs of their chairs, the awkwardness that might have existed between 2 friends separated by 7 years of silence never materialized. Instead, something easier emerged, a picking up of threads that had never actually broken, just been set aside temporarily by grief's necessary isolation. The coffee shop's atmosphere seemed to facilitate this reconnection. The low murmur of other conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle indie folk music playing from speakers tucked into corners, all of it created a cocoon of safety and privacy despite being in a public space. "I should have tried harder to reach you," Catherine said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the heat of the ceramic. The mug was handmade, slightly irregular in shape, with a glaze that shifted from deep blue to turquoise. "I let you push me away. I told myself I was respecting your space, giving you time, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of saying the wrong thing. Afraid of making your pain worse. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, you'd cut me off completely, and I'd lose you forever." Elizabeth shook her head firmly, her hair, which she'd finally released from its severe ponytail, falling in soft waves around her face. "No, Kathy, don't do that. Don't take on guilt that isn't yours. I was the one who disappeared. I was the one who shut everyone out. You tried. You tried so many times. I remember all the calls I didn't answer, all the messages I deleted without reading, because I couldn't face the possibility of human connection. It felt like if I let anyone in, I'd fall apart completely, and I was so afraid that if I fell apart, I'd never be able to put myself back together." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I was angry, too. Angry at Danny for leaving me. Angry at the Army. Angry at myself for not being strong enough. Angry at everyone else for continuing to live normal lives when mine had exploded. And I didn't know how to be around people when I was carrying all that anger along with the grief." "But you didn't fall apart," Marcus observed with the simple clarity children sometimes possess, cutting through adult complexity to essential truth. He looked up from his hot chocolate, which had arrived with a mountain of whipped cream decorated with chocolate shavings and a drizzled caramel. "You're still here." Both women looked at him, and Elizabeth smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look years younger. The transformation was remarkable, as if decades of accumulated sorrow had temporarily lifted, revealing the woman she'd been before loss had carved new lines into her face. "You're right. I'm still here. Some days it felt like failure, like I was supposed to stop existing when Danny did, like my continued existence was somehow a betrayal of our love. But I'm still here. I wake up every morning. I go to work at the library. Did Kathy tell you I finally went back to work? I eat meals. I function. Maybe that's not thriving, but it's surviving, and maybe surviving is enough for now." "Tell me about him," Catherine said gently, her voice soft but encouraging. "Not the hero stuff. Not the soldier. Tell me about Danny, the person you loved, the man who made you laugh, who annoyed you, who was real and flawed and human." Elizabeth took a long sip of coffee, organizing thoughts and memories that she kept locked away because opening them hurt too much. For years, she avoided thinking about the details of their life together, finding it easier to turn Danny into an abstract concept, the fallen soldier, the lost husband, rather than remembering the actual man with all his quirks and contradictions. But sitting here now, with Catherine's patient eyes on her and Marcus's innocent curiosity radiating across the table, she found the words coming more easily than expected. "He couldn't cook to save his life," she began, and then laughed at the memory, surprised by the sound of her own genuine laughter. I mean, truly terrible. He once tried to make me breakfast in bed for my birthday and somehow managed to burn water. I don't know how that's even possible, but he did it. The smoke alarm went off, and he was standing in the kitchen with this bewildered expression, holding a smoking pan, asking where he'd gone wrong. I came running downstairs in my pajamas, thinking the house was on fire, and found him surrounded by smoke, looking so confused and disappointed that he'd ruined the surprise. Catherine laughed, the memory clearly returning to her as well. I remember that. You called me afterward, and you were laughing so hard you could barely talk. You said he'd tried to make you pancakes, but had somehow forgotten to add any liquid, so it was just flour and eggs burning in the pan. He was so proud of himself for attempting it. Elizabeth continued, the memories flowing more easily now, like water finding its course after a dam breaks. He'd gotten up at 6 a.m. to practice before I woke up, which was incredibly sweet, but also completely ridiculous because he was the worst cook in America. After the smoke cleared, he took me to that little diner on Cumberland Avenue instead, the one that closed down a few years ago, and bought me the biggest stack of blueberry pancakes they made. He kept apologizing, but I wasn't upset. I was just touched that he'd tried. She paused, breaking off a piece of her muffin but not eating it, just holding it between her fingers. He was also obsessed with terrible action movies, Elizabeth continued, warming to the subject now, years of silence breaking open to reveal a treasure trove of memories, the kind with ridiculous plots and explosions every 5 minutes. He'd watch them with his completely serious expression, analyzing the military tactics, pointing out everything they got wrong, but he loved them anyway. He said they reminded him that real life was actually more interesting than Hollywood could imagine. We'd have these long debates about whether certain tactical decisions made sense, and he'd get so animated, using salt shakers and napkins to demonstrate proper convoy formations on our dining room table. Marcus listened intently, his hot chocolate temporarily forgotten, building a picture of a man he'd never met but was coming to know through his widow's words. Did he like being a soldier? He asked, then added with a kind of earnest curiosity only children possess. Like, was it his favorite thing? Or was there other stuff he liked better? Elizabeth considered the question carefully, appreciating its complexity. He loved it and hated it, if that makes sense. He loved leading soldiers, taking care of them, making sure they came home to their families. He took that responsibility incredibly seriously. He'd talk about his soldiers all the time, their families, their struggles, their successes. He remembered everyone's birthday, everyone's kids' names. When someone in the unit was struggling, Danny would be the first one there to help, whether it was covering a shift so someone could get their child's school play or lending money to a soldier whose car had broken down. She took another sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. But he hated the bureaucracy, hated being away from home, hated what war does to people, both the ones who fight and the ones they fight against. He wasn't some gung-ho warrior stereotype. He was thoughtful, complicated. He believed in service. But he also questioned everything, wanted to make sure what they were doing actually mattered. He'd come home from deployments quieter, more serious. He'd have nightmares sometimes, wake up sweating and disoriented. We'd sit on the back porch at 2 a.m, and he'd tell me about the weight of making decisions that affected lives, about the impossible choices commanders have to make. It didn't matter, Catherine said firmly, her voice carrying the kind of conviction that comes from absolute certainty. The lives he saved, the soldiers he trained, the decisions he made, all of that mattered. It still matters. Those effects ripple forward, Lizzie. The soldiers he trained went on to train others. The lives he saved went home to families who have children now who wouldn't exist if Danny hadn't made the right call at the right moment. I know, Elizabeth said quietly, her fingers wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. I think I've always known. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. For so long, all I could feel was the absence, the empty side of the bed, the silence where his voice should have been, the future we planned that just evaporated. We were going to have children. We'd picked out names, Oliver for a boy, Charlotte for a girl. We were going to buy a house with a big backyard. He was going to retire from the Army and maybe teach ROTC or work with veterans organizations. We had plans, so many plans, and they all disappeared in the time it took for a roadside bomb to detonate. She pulled out the challenge coin she'd shown Marcus earlier, setting it on the table between them with a soft clink against the wood. In the coffee shop's warm light, it gleamed dully, the brass worn smooth in places from constant handling. I've carried this every single day. At first, it was all I had left of him that felt real. His clothes still smelled like him for a while, but eventually that faded. His voicemails on my phone. I listened to them so many times I memorized every word, every pause, every breath. But this coin, it was something he touched, something he carried, something that was with him. Later, it became a kind of penance, a way to punish myself for surviving when he didn't, for continuing to breathe and eat and exist when he couldn't. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but also with something else. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of peace. But today, when Marcus saluted me, when you saluted me, she corrected, addressing the boy directly. Today, I realize I've been thinking about it all wrong. This coin isn't a reminder of death. It's a reminder of life, of the life Danny lived, the person he was, the love we shared. And carrying it doesn't have to be a burden. It can be a connection, a way to keep him with me not as a ghost haunting my present, but as a part of my history that shaped who I am. Catherine reached across the table and squeezed Elizabeth's hand, her weathered fingers closing around her friend's with gentle pressure. You've been so strong, Lizzie. Stronger than you give yourself credit for. Most people would have crumbled completely. But you kept going, kept surviving, even when surviving felt impossible. I don't feel strong. I feel broken, Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm held together with tape and willpower, and any moment I might just fall apart completely. Broken things can still be beautiful, Marcus said suddenly, and both women turned to him in surprise. He looked slightly embarrassed by their attention, but continued anyway, his young voice steady despite his obvious nervousness at inserting himself into such a serious adult conversation. In art class, we learned about this Japanese thing called kintsugi. It's where they fix broken pottery with gold, and the cracks become part of the design. The teacher said the pottery is more beautiful because it was broken not in spite of it, because the gold shows it has a history. It shows it survived something and came out different but still whole. Elizabeth stared at the boy, her eyes filling with tears again, but these were different from earlier. These weren't tears of pain but of recognition, of seeing herself described in a way that made sense, that honored both her brokenness and her survival. Marcus Riley, you are an old soul in a young body. Has anyone ever told you that? He shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. Grandma says that too. She says I got it from Grandpa, that he was the same way, always thinking about big stuff, always noticing things other people miss. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, Elizabeth said. I only met him a few times before Danny and I moved away for his posting, but I remember he had this way of making everyone feel seen and valued. Catherine, you did an incredible job raising your kids and then helping raise Marcus. This boy is going to change the world someday. The coffee shop door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and a swirl of snowflakes that had begun falling more heavily outside. A handful of people in parade watching gear entered, stamping their feet and brushing snow from their shoulders. One of them, a man in his 40s wearing a veteran's cap with multiple pins and patches indicating various deployments and commendations, paused when he saw Elizabeth at the corner table. His eyes widened slightly in recognition, and after a moment's hesitation, he approached, his expression respectful and slightly nervous. Ma'am, I was in the crowd earlier. I saw what that boy did, saw the salute. I just want to say thank you for your sacrifice, for your husband's service, and for letting us witness that moment. It meant something to a lot of us. His voice was rough, carrying the accent of northern Maine, and his hands twisted his coffee cup nervously. Elizabeth stood, extending her hand with more confidence than she felt. The simple act of standing to greet him rather than remaining seated felt significant, like she was claiming space in the world again after years of trying to make herself invisible. Thank you for being there, for bearing witness. It meant something to me, too. more than I can adequately express. The veteran shook her hand firmly, his grip strong but gentle, the handshake of someone accustomed to careful control. My son served under someone who trained with your husband. Captain Reeves's reputation, ma'am, it traveled. People knew he was the kind of officer who'd never ask his soldiers to do something he wouldn't do himself. That means everything. That means... He paused, struggling with emotion. That means my son came home. So thank you, and I'm sorry for your loss. He nodded to Catherine and Marcus, managed a small smile, and moved to join his own group across the cafe. But he wasn't the last. Over the next hour, several others stopped by their table. Veterans from various eras and branches, family members of service members both living and dead, even people with no direct military connection who'd simply been moved by what they'd seen and felt compelled to acknowledge it. Each one offered brief words of respect, of solidarity, of recognition. A woman who identified herself as the mother of 3 deployed service members thanked Elizabeth for representing all the military spouses who waited and worried. A young man, barely out his teens, said his older brother had been killed in Iraq, and seeing Elizabeth honored had made him feel like someone still remembered all the families who'd lost loved ones, not just on Memorial Day, but every day. An elderly Korean War veteran simply clasped Elizabeth's shoulder, said, "You're one of us," and walked away before she could respond, leaving her stunned by the simple power of inclusion in that statement. What struck Elizabeth most profoundly was that they didn't treat her as broken or pitiable. They didn't speak in a hushed, careful tones people had used at Danny's funeral, the tones that suggested she was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. They treated her as part of a community, someone who'd earned her place through a particular kind of service that military families provide, the waiting, the worrying, the sacrificing of normalcy for something larger than themselves. They treated her as a fellow veteran of sorts, someone who'd served on a different battlefield, but with no less dedication and courage. "I never thought of myself as serving," Elizabeth said to Catherine after another well-wisher had moved on, leaving her with a card for a military spouse support group that met weekly at the VA. "Danny was a soldier. I was just there. I was just a person at home, living my life, waiting for him to come back. Just there." Catherine raised an eyebrow, her expression communicating both affection and gentle challenge. "Lizzie, you held down the home front. You dealt with every deployment, every training exercise, every middle-of-the-night emergency call. You managed finances and households and holidays alone. You were his rock, his reason come home, his safe harbor in the storm of military life. That's service, different from carrying a rifle, but service nonetheless. Every email you sent in the field, every care package you put together, every time you smiled and said everything was fine when you were falling apart inside, that was service." Marcus, who'd been quietly coloring on a paper menu the staff had provided along with a small cup of crayons they kept for children, looked up. His drawing appeared to be an elaborate scene of what might have been a parade, with stick figures and flags, and something that might have been a salute. "My grandma says military families serve too. She says when Grandpa was deployed, she was a single parent to 3 kids, and nobody gave her a medal for that. But it was hard and important anyway. She says sometimes the people who don't get recognized are the ones holding everything together, so the people who do get recognized can do their jobs." "Your grandma is absolutely right," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Catherine with new appreciation, seeing her friend not just as a person who'd tried to stay in her life, but as someone who'd walked the same difficult path and found a way through. "How did you do it, Kathy? How did you survive when your husband was away? And then how did you survive when he came home changed, struggled with things he couldn't talk about? And then how did you survive after he died? How did you keep going?" Catherine took a long moment before answering, her eyes distant with memory, looking not at Elizabeth but through her to some past landscape only she could see. "I survived by letting people help me, by accepting that I couldn't do it alone, no matter how much I wanted to prove I was strong enough to handle everything by myself, by building a community of other military spouses who understood without having to explain, who knew what it meant to smile through fear, to function through exhaustion, to maintain normalcy for children who needed stability even when your world was chaos." She turned her coffee mug slowly in her hands, watching the light play across its glazed surface. And after he died, she paused, choosing her words carefully, knowing they mattered, that Elizabeth was truly listening for the first time in years. After he died, I survived by staying connected to that community, by finding ways to keep his memory alive that felt meaningful rather than painful, by raising these grandkids of mine and teaching them about honor and service and love, by letting myself be both sad and happy, both broken and healing, by understanding that grief doesn't end, it just changes shape, becomes something you carry differently. I didn't have that, Elizabeth said, her voice small and regretful. Or rather, I had it, but I pushed it away. I convinced myself that isolation was the only way to manage the pain, that if I kept myself separate from everyone else, I could control how much it hurt. But all I did was make the hurt deeper and more lonely. And now, Catherine asked, her voice gentle but insistent, what do you think now? Elizabeth looked around the coffee shop, at the people who'd approached her with respect and recognition rather than pity, at Marcus with his old soul wisdom and his perfect salute and his drawing that somehow captured the essence of what had happened at the parade, at her friend who'd waited 7 years without giving up, who'd sent her grandson to deliver a message she couldn't ignore. The snow was falling more heavily outside now, visible through the fog windows, transforming the street into something clean and new. Now I think maybe I was wrong, she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them. Maybe there's another way. Maybe I don't have to choose between honoring Danny's memory and living my own life. Maybe I can do both. Maybe grief doesn't have to mean isolation. Maybe... She trailed off, overwhelmed by the possibilities she denied herself for so long. There is, Catherine confirmed, her voice warm with certainty and love. It won't make the grief disappear. Danny's absence will always be there, and some days will still be hard. Anniversaries, holidays, random Tuesday afternoons when something reminds you of him and the loss hits like it's brand new. But you don't have to carry it alone in the dark anymore. You don't have to punish yourself for surviving. You don't have to disappear. The conversation drifted gradually to lighter topics. Reminiscences about funnier times before tragedy reshaped their worlds. Updates on mutual friends and acquaintances they'd lost touch with over the years. Catherine's other grandchildren and their various adventures and misadventures. Marcus showed Elizabeth his drawings, explaining elaborate stories about each stick figure and crayon landscape, his imagination transforming simple shapes into epic narratives. Elizabeth found herself genuinely engaged, asking questions, laughing at his creative interpretations, feeling like a person again rather than just a monument to loss. The afternoon light shifted from gray morning to silvery afternoon, the promised snow falling steadily now in soft, lazy flakes that drifted past the window and accumulated on the street outside. The coffee shop had grown busier, filling with people seeking warmth and caffeine after the parade, their voices creating a comfortable buzz of conversation. The barista had changed shifts, and the new one, an older man with a white beard and kind eyes, had noticed their little group in the corner and made a point of checking on them periodically, offering fresh coffee and understanding smiles. Eventually, Elizabeth pulled out her phone, staring at it as if the device were alien technology. The screen was cracked in one corner. She'd dropped it months ago and never bothered to fix it, operating with a kind of passive neglect toward material things that no longer seemed important. I haven't checked social media in years, she admitted, her thumb hovering over the app she'd abandoned. I shut it all down after Danny died because I couldn't handle people's condolences or their moving on with their lives while mine had stopped. I could watch friends posting about their happy moments, engagements, babies, promotions, when I felt like my life had ended. You don't have to look, Catherine said quickly, protectively, reaching across the table as if to physically stop her. Not if you're not ready. There's no rush. But Elizabeth was already opening apps, logging into accounts she'd abandoned, passwords still mysteriously remembered by devices that held on to information she tried to forget. Her eyes widened as she scrolled, her expression transforming from apprehension to shock to something like wonder. Kathy, look at this. She turned the phone so Catherine and Marcus could see. The videos and photos from the parade had spread widely, far more widely than anyone could have anticipated. Someone had filmed Marcus breaking formation and saluting Elizabeth, had captured the moment with remarkable clarity despite the crowd and the confusion. The veterans joining in, the crowd stunned silence, The official moment of silence called by the parade marshal, all of it had been documented and shared across multiple platforms. The original video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. People had shared it with captions like, "This is what honor looks like," and "Remember the families who sacrificed too," and "A boy teaches us all about respect." The comments numbered in the thousands, and as Elizabeth scrolled through them, Catherine reading over her shoulder, they found a remarkable tapestry of human connection and shared experience. Veterans were sharing their own stories, expressing gratitude for the reminder that military families serve too. Military families were thanking Elizabeth for representing their experiences, for making visible the invisible sacrifices they made. Civilians were expressing newfound understanding of what sacrifice really meant, of how war's casualties extended far beyond the battlefield. One comment in particular caught Elizabeth's attention, standing out among the thousands for its specific, personal detail. It was from someone claiming to have served in Danny's unit. Posted just an hour ago, "Captain Reeves saved my life in Helmand. I've thought about him every day for 7 years, but never knew how to reach his family to say thank you. Now I can. Thank you for your sacrifice, Mrs. Reeves. Your husband's legacy lives on in every soldier he trained, every decision he made, every life he touched. He taught me to lead with integrity and compassion. He showed me that being strong doesn't mean being hard, that taking care of your people is the highest calling of leadership. My daughter exists because he made the right call at the right moment. Thank you." Elizabeth read the comment aloud, her voice breaking multiple times, and Catherine reached across to hold her hand once again, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "You see," Catherine said, her voice urgent but gentle, "you were never alone. The people who knew what Danny meant, who carried pieces of his impact, they've been there all along, living their lives and remembering him in 1,000 different ways. You just needed to be ready to see them, and they needed to know how to find you." "That boy," Elizabeth said, looking at Marcus with overwhelming gratitude that threatened to overflow into fresh tears. "That brave, incredible boy broke formation so I could find my way back to mine. He stepped out of line so I could step back into community I'd abandoned." Marcus looked up from his drawing, his serious hazel eyes meeting hers with that weight of understanding that seemed far beyond his years. "Grandma says sometimes the bravest thing is asking for help, or letting someone help you. Is that what you're doing now?" Elizabeth laughed, a sound of genuine joy that surprised her with its authenticity. She hadn't laughed like this, freely, without the bitter edge of irony or the hollow echo of forced cheerfulness, in 7 years. "Yes, Marcus, I think that's exactly what I'm doing now." As the afternoon stretched toward evening and the snow continued to fall, coating Portland in a fresh white blanket that softened harsh edges and made the world feel new and full of possibility, Elizabeth Reeves made a decision. Actually, she made several decisions, each one building on the others, creating a structure of forward momentum that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She would return to the veterans community she'd abandoned, would attend the events she'd avoided, would show up not as a ghost or a cautionary tale, but as a living person with agency and voice. She would reach out to Danny's former soldiers and their families, would build bridges to the people who'd known him in ways she never could, would learn about the parts of his life that existed beyond their marriage. She would volunteer at the VA, would attend the support groups Catherine had been gently suggesting for years, would let herself be seen again by people who understood the particular contours of military grief. More than that, she would let herself live again, not in spite of Danny's death, but in honor of the life they'd shared and the love that survived even physical absence. She would carry his challenge coin not as a burden or a penance, but as a reminder that she, too, had served, had sacrificed, had earned her place in the story. She would stop punishing herself for surviving, would recognize that her continued existence wasn't betrayal, but a testament to what they'd built together. And most importantly, she would stay connected to Catherine Riley and her remarkable grandson, who'd been brave enough to break formation, to step out of line, to offer a gesture that changed everything. She would be the kind of person who showed up for others the way they'd shown up for her, would pay forward the grace she'd been given. As they finally prepared to leave the coffee shop, the light outside fading to early winter evening, the snow creating a hushed blanket that muffled the sounds of the city, Elizabeth hugged Marcus tightly one more time. She knelt down to his level, her hands on his small shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. "You know what you did today?" she asked him, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I saluted you," he said simply, with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "You did more than that. You reminded me that I'm part of something bigger than my grief. You showed me that honor isn't just about dying for something. It's about living for something, about remembering, about connection, about having the courage to reach across the space between isolation and community." She pulled back slightly but kept her hands on his shoulders, making sure he understood the weight of what she was saying. "You're going to do great things in your life, Marcus Riley. Important things. And when you do, I hope you'll remember that sometimes the most important things are the smallest gestures offered at exactly the right moment. Sometimes changing the world looks like a 9-year-old boy walking across a parade route to salute a stranger. Sometimes it looks like breaking the rules because following them would mean missing what really matters." Marcus nodded seriously, then surprised her by hugging her back with fierce, uncomplicated affection. "I'm glad you're not going to be alone anymore," he said into her shoulder. "Grandma was really worried about you." Outside, the snow had transformed Portland into a winter wonderland. The historic brick buildings frosted with white like gingerbread houses, the streetlights casting warm glows to the falling flakes that created halos of gold in the darkening evening. The parade was long over, the crowds dispersed to their homes and families, the streets being gradually reclaimed by the quieter rhythms of ordinary life. But the impact of what had happened would ripple forward for years to come, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen. For Elizabeth Reeves, this Veterans Day marked a new kind of anniversary, not just the day she lost her husband, but the day she found her way back to the community of people who understood her loss, who honored her sacrifice, who refused to let her disappear into grief's isolation. It was the day she learned that survival could transform into something more, that carrying on could become a choice rather than just an automatic function. And for Marcus Riley, it marked the day he learned that courage sometimes means breaking the rules, stepping out of formation, offering a salute to someone the world had forgotten, and in doing so, reminding everyone watching what service and sacrifice and remembrance really mean. It was the day he discovered that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform or carry weapons, that sometimes it looks like a simple gesture offered with love and respect. As they walked together through the snowy evening, 3 generations connected by love and loss and the decision to bear witness to each other's pain and resilience, Catherine Riley smiled to herself. Her husband would have been proud of his grandson, and somewhere she believed Captain Daniel Reeves was proud too, proud of the boy who saluted his widow, proud of the community that rallied around her, and most of all, proud of Elizabeth for finding the courage to live again in a world that no longer included him but still held his memory in every life he'd touched. The parade had ended, but the living memorial, the one built of human connection and mutual support and the refusal to let sacrifice be forgotten, would continue, growing stronger with each person who chose to see the invisible, to honor the overlooked, to break formation for something that mattered more than order. And it all started with a small boy who knew that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply show up for someone who doesn't expect to be seen, who believed that a salute could be a bridge between isolation and connection, who understood that remembering the dead means honoring the living who carry their legacy forward. As the snow continued to fall and the evening deepened, Portland settled into its winter quiet. But in one coffee shop in the hearts of 3 people walking home together, something warm and alive was beginning to grow. The kind of hope that survives even the darkest grief. The kind of connection that proves love doesn't end just because life does.